Hello, everybody. The assessment policy is the work of primarily the work of the sub-TWG on classroom assessment, but it is also the work of the bureaus of secondary education, elementary education. It's also the work of the national TWG. It's also the work of, to a large extent, Brother Armin, because at every stage of the revision, we would consult him and ask him if this was acceptable. Um, we are proud to show you that the DepEd Order number 8 of 2015, Policy Guidelines on Classroom Assessment for the K-12 Basic Education Program, will be released today. We are excited because what we have done is we have collated all the feedback from the various stakeholders of the assessment policy, from central office to regional office to division office, and of course, some schools. No? We couldn't, of course, consult all schools, but some schools, so that we could pull together their feedback on the assessment system. Another consideration is that the assessment system has to make sense also for alternative learning system, and that the connections are imaginable. At the moment, the articulation of the assessment system for ALS isn't there yet. However, it was very important that while we were crafting the policy guidelines for classroom assessment, that we could immediately see how we could translate this in alternative ways. So let me begin with the theoretical basis. Just like the K-12 basic education program, we are drawing from constructivist theory. And the main thing that we are trying to do is to ensure that during the assessment process, appropriate assessment is used to ensure learner success, to move from guided practice to independent display of knowledge, understanding, and skills. So we actually start from learners, where learners are. And in so doing, we also recognize the value of explicit instruction so that we know what sort of instruction is required at the beginning of a lesson, during the lesson for guided practice, and of course, after the lesson for independent practice. We also want to make sure and enable learners to transfer knowledge, understanding, and skills successfully into future contexts. The other thing that we draw from the zone of proximal development idea of Vygotsky is that we need assessment to facilitate the development of higher order thinking skills and 21st century skills as articulated in the basic education program. On the next slide, we also emphasize that the assessment system of the K-12 recognizes the diversity of learners inside the classroom. We need to remember that we cannot craft an assessment system that is applicable only to one community. We need to recognize that in cities, mountains, rural areas, fishing villages, there are mixes of cultures, religions, languages, and of course, people. And therefore, that leads us to number 2, that we need to assess in various ways and in multiple ways so that we can tap onto the learner's potentials and abilities so that in the assessment process, learners are co-participants. In the constructivist theory, it's very important to emphasize that the teachers and the learners participate in a joint assessment process. And what we are trying to do here is we're trying to make make assessment inform instruction. And it should be always in unity. What is a classroom assessment? Let's go to the bits of it already. The third thing about classroom assessment is that we're going to use it to track learner progress in relation to the learner or learning competencies and curriculum standards that are articulated in our curriculum. So the most important idea here is that the assessment system dovetails with the curriculum. The fourth thing is that it provides us a basis for profiling students vis-a-vis these competencies. In other words, what we are able to do, we've been able to articulate the learning competencies in a good sequence in our curriculum guides. Our curriculum guides are well arranged from first quarter to fourth quarter following a sequence of easy to difficult. In the same way, by following the curriculum guides and making sure that assessment is connected to curriculum, we make sure that we are also following the curriculum guides in the assessment of competencies, again, from easy to difficult. And we should be able to profile children who are able to work with the easier competencies, have trouble with the more difficult competencies, and follow them through. While we do assessment, and because assessment in the classroom is equally important to teacher and student, we have to help students develop self-reflection and personal accountability for their own learning. That's why they have to know exactly how they are doing at any given point in time. Number 7, using classroom assessment as a process of identifying, gathering, organizing, and interpreting quantitative and qualitative information about what learners know and can do will definitely lead to better teaching. I think that if teachers are enabled to do those 4 things, identify, gather, organize, interpret data about their students' learning, we will be able to use, or they will be better able to use assessment information for better instruction. Number 7, classroom assessment method should be consistent with curriculum standards. Whenever we assess in the classroom, we make sure that our assessment is consistent with the objectives of the lesson. And naturally, teachers should make sure that the objectives of every lesson is hinged or are hinged on the curriculum standards. And finally, number 8, we need to be able to see what sort of competencies or what competencies are already covered by the children. And always the point of view is we want to know how they are progressing on the competencies. So what is assessed in the classroom? Assessed are content standards, performance standards, and learning competencies. Content standards cover a specified scope of sequential topics within each learning area or strand, domain, theme, or component. They answer the question, what should learners know? Performance standards, on the other hand, describe the abilities and skills that learners are expected to demonstrate in relation to the content standards and also demonstrate integration of 21st century skills. They answer the following questions. What can learners do with what they know? How well must learners do their work? How well do learners use their learning or understanding in different situations? How do learners apply their learning or understanding in real-life contexts? And what tools and measures should learners use to demonstrate what they know? Finally, the smaller bits are learning competencies. Learning competencies refer to the knowledge, understanding, skills, and attitudes that learners need to demonstrate in every lesson or learning activity. To align with the assessment process with the K-12 curriculum, we adapted the cognitive process dimensions, which may be used as a guide to the formulation of assessment tasks and activities. These are based on Bloom's taxonomy, but they are an upgrade of the Bloom's taxonomy, and it starts with remembering, understanding, applying, analyzing, and then ends up with evaluating and creating. The descriptors for every level are on your slide, and they're definitely on the department order. So I will refer you to the department order. But let me cite you an example of how we are connecting and how we need to think about the K-12 basic education assessment system or framework for the classroom, and how we are migrating to this system from DepEd Order 73. So just an example, for example, curriculum standards, which are articulated in content and performance standards. And let us, for example, just get one of the first component of K-POP, of DepEd Order 73, knowledge. So what should students know? How are they to express or provide evidence of what they know? In the cognitive process dimensions, we can tap onto 2, which would be remembering. The learner can identify, retrieve, recognize, duplicate, list, memorize, repeat, and reproduce. And applying. The learner can execute, implement, demonstrate, dramatize, interpret, solve, use, illustrate, convert, and discover. So this is a way of looking at how we are migrating from one assessment system to another. Here's another example for process. Process on DepEd Order 73 asks the questions, what can students do with the information or facts they have in relation to familiar situations? Number 2, what are the evidence of what they can do with the information and facts they have? In the K-12 assessment system, this would intersect with understanding, applying, and analyzing. When we look at understanding, which answers the questions, what breadth of understanding do the students have regarding the information and facts that they know? And what are the evidence of the breadth and depth of understanding that the students have reached? And this now interfaces with understanding, applying, analyzing, and evaluating. And finally, for performance or product, DepEd Order 73 asks 2 questions. What innovations in terms of products and performance are learners able to do? And what are the evidence that learners can use or transfer their learning in real life or different situations? This intersects mostly with applying and creating. So with this kind of migration from one system to the other, what we're able to do is to connect better our content and performance standards with our assessment system. Now, how are learners assessed in the classroom? We drew from the UNESCO program on teaching and learning for sustainable futures, and it defines formative assessment as ongoing forms of assessment closely linked to the learning process, and it is informal. It provides immediate feedback to both learner and teacher. It helps prepare learners for summative assessments, and it is recorded but not included as basis for grading. So when is formative assessment done? Okay. So if you have a lesson, and we have 3 essential parts of a lesson, these are the bare minimum parts of the lesson: before the lesson, during the lesson, and after the lesson, then we have different purposes for formative assessment for each part. So for example, before the lesson, the purposes for the learner correspond to the purposes for the teacher. The emphasis of formative assessment is that information must be usable by both teacher and learner. So for example, for the learner, know what he or she knows about the topic or lesson. On the other side of the column, for the teachers, is to get information about what the learner already knows and can do about the coming lesson or the new lesson. So what we've done is we've matched what learners and teachers should do with the information. For the next one, which is during the lesson, again, we've done the same thing. No? Based on the feedback from so many people on this department order on classroom assessment, we've been able to do this by trying to see what happens during a lesson and trying to help teachers clarify in their minds what they should be doing while they are teaching. So for example, while they are teaching, let's say it's a group activity, then the teacher should be able to provide immediate feedback to the learners. So the learners will know what their strengths and weaknesses are. They should be able to identify learning gaps for the learner so that the student or the children will be able to help themselves overcome these learning gaps. For after the lesson, there are other purposes also. For example, for the learner to tell and recognize whether he or she met the learning objectives and of course, met the success criteria for that particular lesson. On the teacher side, the teacher has to assess whether the learning objectives have been met for a specified duration, whether he or she needs to remediate or enrich, and of course, if you need to do some reteaching again. After formative assessment, the second component of classroom assessment is called summative assessment. Summative assessment may be seen as the assessment of learning. So, summative assessment usually occurs towards the end of a period of learning in order to describe the standard reached by the learner. In other words, it's always looking at the learner's performance in relation to a particular standard. Using the UNESCO definition, summative assessment is comprised of judgments derived that are usually for the benefit of other people other than the learner. So, if formative assessment is for direct classroom use, summative assessment may include other people. And who might they be? Siyempre, obviously, parents. Obviously, school heads. And if necessary, summative assessments will have to inform those who are giving out scholarships, those who are providing children with opportunities to support their education. So summative assessment must be very seriously taken. The results of summative assessment are recorded and are included in the computation of the final grade. Now, what are the components of summative assessment? There are three: written work, performance task, and quarterly assessment. So what's written work? Written work in summative assessment ensures that students are able to express learned skills and concepts in written form. And these may include essays, written reports, long quizzes, and other such written output. For example, they will convert a short story to a play. That would be written work. Okay? Performance tasks allows learners to show what they know and are able to do in diverse ways. They also may create or innovate products or do performance-based tasks. Written output may also be considered performance tasks depending on the learning area. In performance tasks, the focus is on the performance, not the product, not the project, but the way to get to the product. So in other words, we are looking more at process. We want to avoid this thing where we grade the project and it was the father who made the project, diba? Or the brother. What we want to do is to be able to track the stages of product development by looking at how the student actually made it. And finally, the quarterly assessment measures student learning at the end of the quarter, and this may be in the form of objective tests, an objective test. It may be in the form of performance-based assessment, particularly important for applied areas like sport, art, tech voc. But it can also be, and I think this is a good thing, a combination of the two. For written work, it is strongly recommended that items in long quizzes or tests be distributed across the cognitive process domains so that our long tests and quizzes don't just focus on remembering or worse, it only focuses on the critical and the analysis. We need a good spread because we must allow the diverse children in our classroom to show what they know. Our tests are not designed only for those who can show what they know on difficult items. Our tests should allow all learners to show what they know and what they can do. Appendix A of DepEd Order 8 was developed by a large group of people, and it has a list of examples of summative assessment tools per learning area. Formative assessment and summative assessment can be done individually or collaboratively. For example, in formative assessment, individual assessment will demonstrate what the learner has learned or mastered by showing it as an individual. Or they can do it collaboratively. One way is by peer assessment, when group mates rate each other, for example, or group mates give feedback on how well he or she performed or contributed to a group output. Or collaborative assessment might also be a classroom project or a poster made by the class. And of course, the assessment would be done for the entire group. the importance of collaborative assessment cannot be downplayed. It's very important to allow children to work together because collaborative work is an essential feature of 21st century thinking. Summative assessment at an individual level, obviously, unit tests and quarterly assessments are done individually. And for group activities such as putting out a play or mounting an exhibit or doing a performance exhibit, these things are collaboratively done. And therefore, there must be very clear instructions to students what they are expected to do first, and second, very clear indicators to students on how they will be assessed on what they are expected to do. So let's go to the grading system. For kindergarten, the grading of kindergarten is very qualitative, right? We're not using numerical grades in kindergarten. We use a lot of checklists, anecdotal records, portfolios, compilations of children's work. And these are now shown to parents, and parents see what their children are able to do over time. I think the trick here is to remember that in showing what kindergarteners can do, we must need to show it as time progresses. You cannot show it at one point in time because these little children, they learn very fast and develop very fast, and we need to record them. For grades 1 to 12, learners are graded on the three components: written work, performance tasks, and the quarterly assessment. And this is given, obviously, every quarter. Kasi quarterly assessment, di ba? Okay. These components are given percentage, weights, and these vary by learning area. Third, all grades are based on weighted raw scores of the summative assessment.